that you would help us to be tolerant and respectful to each other. We give you thanks for your abundant grace and your mercy toward us. I pray your blessings on every member and visitor present here today. And we ask that you would continue to guide us as we attend to the various matters that you have endowed us with. Thank you once again, dear Father, for your presence. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Please be seated. Motion for the approval of the order paper as circulated.
Recognize the member for Nevis 3.
Madam President, I rise to seek leave to have an amendment to the order paper as circulated on the item I, Public Business, Bill second and third readings. Instead of the Honorable Minister of Finance, who will move the second and third readings, I beg leave to have that amended to read, Member for Nevis 3 will move the second and third readings of the Nevis International Banking Amendment Bill 2024.
Thank you. I recognize the member for Nevis 1.
Madam President, good morning. I rise to second the motion for one, to have the order paper amended, and also support its approval.
Thank you. The question is that the order paper as amended be approved. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Messages from the Deputy Governor General.
Thank you. I will make reference to one message. We have received one message from the Deputy Governor General pursuant to Standing Orders 25 and 53. And that message relates to the resolution that is stated on the order paper that was circulated, granting the approval of the Deputy Governor General for that matter to be considered as is required by the Constitution and the National Assembly Elections Act. Thank you.
Announcements by the President.
Yes, thank you. Good morning again, members, honorable members. Good morning again to those visitors in the gallery, members of the public who are present and those who are viewing. I have a few announcements. Firstly, I'd like to express our gratitude to those of you members of the House, as well as public stakeholders who would have participated in the National CPA Benchmarks Assessment exercise that was recently conducted. That exercise is really geared towards improving our parliamentary practices and procedures, and that national activity was being conducted. And because of the close relationship between our houses, the Nevis Island Assembly and the National Parliament, we would have had engagements from some of you with the CPA assessors so that we can get the relevant feedback and report to continue to improve and enhance our parliaments to ensure that they function according to the standards set for democratic parliaments. So thank you for your willingness and your participation in that exercise. And in the same vein, I would like to encourage members of the House to take advantage of the avenues that are available to you for continued development in relation to parliamentary practice and procedure that is available through the CPA Parliamentary Academy. And recently we would have shared some resources with you in relation to AI, disinformation and parliament. And I encourage all of you to take advantage of the courses that are available, the information that is being circulated so that we can continue to advance ourselves in this regard. Thirdly, and as I mentioned, continuing education, you may have heard our recent call for applications for persons between the ages of 15 and 28 who are interested in joining the Nevis Youth Parliament. That information was circulated for a few weeks, and the deadline for receipt of applications is this Friday, 21st June 2024. Application forms may be collected from the Legislature Office at the Johnson Jones Building on Government Road. So we encourage everyone between the ages of 15 to 28 who are interested to submit your applications to become a part of the Nevis Youth Parliament. Members of the press, this notice is for you. Please be reminded that for you to be present and performing as a member of the media or press in the House, you are required to have the leave or permission of the House. And this is according to Standing Order 82, and it is in the interest of protection of our members and maintaining the standard of the House. So please ensure, members of the press, before you're present, before you are carrying out functions that are affiliated with press and public relations, that you have that permission from the President of the House. I can confirm that we have recently granted additional permissions, but just a reminder for those of you who may not have received permission, please regularize your status or you may be asked to leave or withdraw from the House. Finally, or almost finally, you may notice that the coat of arms behind me looks a little different. The former representation that we had for our coat of arms did not fully accord with the official national symbol. And so we made some changes so that the coat of arms is reflective of what it should be. And we want to express our gratitude to Miss Ashira Hanley, who did an excellent job in reproducing the coat of arms. And it is, now in the correct model that it should be. So we are grateful to her and happy that we were able to complete this exercise. Under announcements, want to indicate that I've received apologies from the Honourable Member for Nevis 2, who will be unable to join us at the sitting this morning. He was out of the jurisdiction and due to matters beyond his control was unable to return to the jurisdiction in time to be present at the sitting, although he had every intention to present certain matters that are on the order paper. So we have apologies expressed from him. And finally, I'd just like to remind members and visitors to observe the normal protocols and rules of decorum of the House as we proceed with today's business. And that brings us to the end of the announcements. Thank you.
Papers to be laid. Statements by ministers.
I recognize the Honourable Senator Nisbet.
Madam President, members on the government side, member of the opposition, visitors in the gallery, those viewing and listening online, good morning. I join you here today to bring brief updates from the Ministry of Health, Gender Affairs and Social Empowerment. I want to begin these updates, in a sense, on a somber note to express my condolences to the family, friends, and well-wishers of one of our MUA scholars, Ms. Tamara Davis, who would have passed recently. She received the MUA scholarship in 2020 and was a very bright, intelligent, and general upbeat young person. And it's such a tragedy that her life was cut short at this time. So I want to express my sincere condolences to her parents, especially, who works in the Ministry of Health and Education, as well as her families and friends. Madam President, forgive me. She was also a past student who I didn't recognize her name at first, and then I realized that she was also a past student of mine. In the Ministry of Health and Gender Affairs and Social Empowerment, Madam President, we also celebrate life, health, and general overall wellness. So at this time, I want to also recognize our centenarians who would have celebrated on Centenarians Day on May 31st. And we have 4 centenarians here residing on Nevis, and one of our centenarians from Nevis who is now resident on the island of St. Kitts. So we had Miss Eliza Jeffers. She is the eldest centenarian in the entire Federation at the age of 104. She resides in Hamilton Estate. Miss Olga Jeffers is 100 from Camps Village. Miss Lenora Wenham Herbert is also 100, and she resides in Bath. And we had Miss Leontine Clark in the parish of St. John's. Mr. Clarence Hendrickson, as I mentioned, he is from Nevis, but he is currently resident in St. Kitts, and he is 101 years old. Madam President, we recognize, of course, a pattern, and it is true across the world that the life expectancy of women tend to outweigh that of men. So we are, in fact, prioritizing our men's health, especially in the month of June, which we celebrate as International Men's Health Month. So within the Ministry of Health and through the Health Promotion Unit, we recently held a Man Talk health screening as well as informational session for the men on the island of Nevis, where you're able to screen, know your status, hear some testimonies from individuals who would have suffered due to lack of focus on their health, so that they can inspire other men to do better going forward. So that event was held on Sunday, the 9th of June at the Malcolm Gishard Park, and it was in collaboration with Lake Health, Wellbeing, and the Taiwan ICDF. And it was most definitely a successful afternoon. I think we had approximately 30 men, and they were very engaged and took advantage of the screenings that we had available to them. If I can just transition a little bit to social services, I just want to update the general public that the LIFT program that is done through the federal government, the first phase of that program where they re-verified all the previous recipients on the PAP program, that re-verification process ended on the 31st of May. So if you were on the program, you were given all the notices to re-verify through Von Radio. The staff at social services would have engaged those who were on file and assisted who needed that assistance. So now we have the LIFT program. The same program is now open for new registrants. So now is the time that if you feel that you meet the requirements of the individuals who we are trying to target, you go and you check for the requirements, of course. Make sure that everything is honest and in order, and you can apply with also the assistance of our team at Social Services, who is willing to assist those who might have some challenges with the technical process. while we're speaking of assistance, I also want to congratulate, in a sense, the set of individuals, babies, who were on our daycare assistance program. You know, we would have mentioned that we launched that assistance program last year, and several of these children are now graduating into our preschool system, so they will be coming off the program. And I want to remind the public that this is, of course, a rolling program. There's no specific application date for this program, as babies are born every day and enrolled in daycare every day. So we encourage members of the public as well who meet the requirements of this daycare assistance program. It's a needs-based program. You can reach out to the Department of Gender Affairs and they will guide you through the very simple application process, and we can provide that necessary assistance. And while we are on the matter of social assistance, I want to underscore that we are staying true to our mandate, where we are attempting to give a hand up rather than simply handouts. And so through the Department of Social Services, we continue to try and provide resources to train and empower these individuals who benefit from our social assistance program. So on the 22nd of May, the Department of Social Services held their annual disaster preparedness training, and this would have targeted 70 recipients of the various social assistance program that we have here currently on Nevis. And so these participants were able to benefit from that knowledge, skill, instructions on how to plan for this hurricane season, which the member for Nevis 1 will, I'm sure, highlight is projected to be one of the busiest that we have upcoming. We are praying that we are safe throughout that season. However, we must always be prepared. In the Department of Community Development, they continue to do great work. In the last month, I think it was this month, in June, the Barnesgut Community Group would have celebrated their Barnesgut Breadfruit Festival, and this would have marked the 10th anniversary of that festival. And I want to highlight as well that in May, Jessups would have also celebrate their 10th anniversary of the Jessup Seafood Fiesta. So it shows that we are investing in community development that has some longevity and that the community has now valued, and we're seeing these significant time stamps for these celebrations. So we want to thank our participants, sponsors, collaborators, and of course the department for continuing to work around the clock to make these visions a reality. The Department of Community Development also conducted a sewing workshop at the Barnesgut Community Center, and I had the privilege of handing out the certificates yesterday at their closing ceremony, where 12 persons would have participated. Now, Madam President, they were wearing their outfits that they made during this workshop, and I must say that when I entered and I saw everybody, I did not look around and think, oh, they're wearing their outfits. I had no knowledge, based on how refined and tailored their outfits were, that these were what was made by these participants, until someone had to point out, no, everyone is wearing their outfits. So I must say that we have some budding seamstresses coming up, and if you want to reach out to any of them, I think some of them are considering going into business, and I support their drive towards entrepreneurship. The same department, Community Development, will also be hosting their annual Camp Refresh workshop, camp, of course, for children from July 15 to July 26. So you can feel free to contact the department if you are accustomed to sending your child, or if you want to enroll them for the first time this year. It promises, of course, to be a learning experience, an enjoyable experience, and to enrich their lives throughout the summer break. In the Ministry of Health, Madam President, I want to also give kudos to the Health Promotion Unit once again for launching our Health Scope magazine. It is a digital magazine that they launched on May 1st. Although the first edition we had some print copies just to be able to mark the significance of the occasion, this will be a digital magazine going forward that will be produced quarterly. And the aim of this magazine, Madam President, is to provide a source that you're sure of. I think we're bombarded every day with information from social media, from friends, family, every which way, even disputable media sites that purport to be proper sources of information, but we want to be able to provide individuals with information that they know for a fact is legitimate and can be substantiated. The Gingerland Dental Unit underwent some work recently, and I'm happy to report that the services have restarted there at the Gingerland Dental Unit, so individuals in that area can be rest assured that they can access all dental services previously given there once again. Yesterday, Madam President, I had the privilege of joining the team at the Behavioral Health and Wellness Center as they were able to reap some of the first produce of their grow boxes. Now, they would have... So quick? Yes. So I have some lettuce home to make some good healthy wrap because we were able to reap that. And he said, Minister, the member for Nevis, 3, would have indicated so quick because this in fact was launched on May 21st at the facility, and we were able to reap actual fully grown lettuce yesterday. It was over 30 plus head of lettuce that we were able to reap, yes, from those grow boxes yesterday. And these lettuce were planted and tended to by some of the individuals who access service at the Behavioral Health and Wellness Center. And so it's important to highlight the value of agriculture in maintaining our mental health, Madam President. The act of going outside and actually planting and watching that seed produce into something that you can eat is therapeutic of sorts, and we're happy that we're able to join a lot of our mission to enhance mental health as well as to promote healthier living, eating, and active lifestyle all together to bring that to success. I want to thank the Department of Agriculture and A1 Farms, who are our main partners in making that a reality. So kudos to those teams. I just got to come in and reap the benefits. But the team did put in quite a bit of work there. While I'm thanking and congratulating, I want to thank and congratulate the individuals who would have, 13 individuals who would have passed their APCO Institute training to become emergency dispatchers. Now, we had 16 individuals who passed the course. However, 13 of them will be serving as emergency dispatchers, and we have the other 3 as volunteer or reserved, one including Permanent Secretary Martin Clark, who did the training so that if there's ever a time when we need to call upon someone to volunteer that extra time to fill a gap, we have those reserve officers. And I must say, Madam President, that the lowest, this is the lowest score that was achieved, was 80%. So you know that you can be confident that all individuals passed the course and did an excellent job with high scores of up to 99%. So congratulations to those individuals who passed that very intense training course. And we're hoping to have our emergency dispatch system fully up and running soon. All the radios have been installed. The fire, police, disaster have all been fitted with their portable radios and trained on how to use the system. So we're on the precipice, Madam President, and these individuals have been trained so that when you connect with them, they're able to provide immediate assistance to you while secondary help is en route to you. So if your child is choking and you're on the phone with the dispatcher, while they might dispatch the ambulance to you, we don't want you to sit there and wonder what to do now. They have received the appropriate training where they should be able to try and guide you to relieving that problem at the time. Madam President, I will bring it to a close by also congratulating our Boys of Excellence. It was celebrated on May 16th, and annually, of course, we identify Boys of Excellence across all the primary and secondary schools on Nevis, and so I want to give them that recognition because it is something to be identified in an entire school and highlighted as the Boy of Excellence. So for the Joycelyn Libert Primary School, we had Mr. Daniel Lau. For the Cecily Brown Integrated School, we had Mr. Xavier Zine Stapleton. I apologize if I pronounce any names incorrectly. For the St. Thomas's Primary School, Javante Hondas Maynard. Charlestown Primary, Jamoy Nisbet. Montessori Academy, Abraham Sile. Maud Cross Preparatory, Tebron Hendrickson. Nevis Academy, Kejon Harrier. Gingerland Secondary, Delonte Warner. Elizabeth Pemberton Primary School, Calvin Wilkin Jr. Nevis International Secondary, Rashawn Weeks. Ivor Walters Primary, Kenai Elliott. Charlestown Secondary, Jaden Dennis Clark. St. James Primary, Zane Mintos. And the Violet O. Jeffers Nichols Primary School, Deshaun James. So congratulations to all of you. You are boys of excellence, and we hope to see you grow up to be men of excellence. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I recognize the Honorable Senator Nisbet. Libert, sorry.
Madam President, thank you and good morning to everybody. With your leave, I'll just make a brief statement under this section on a few things of interest happening in the Ministry of Education, Sports, et al. First of all, allow me to announce the appointment of Ms. Londa Brown as the Principal Education Officer, or the officer in charge of the Department of Education. Allow me to congratulate her on her appointment. Of course, the post was previously held by Zanella Claxton, who was promoted to the post of Permanent Secretary. So we now have Ms. Londa Brown, who will take up the post as the Principal Education Officer. I also want to congratulate Mr. Onaje Amri, of course, who is one of our good young cricketers. He also works at the Department of Sports. He has been called up to play for the West Indies Academy on the tour of Ireland. He joins young Carlin Bowen Tuckett, who was previously on the tour. They're now touring Ireland, playing the emerging island on the tour of Ireland. So I wish to commend both of them and to wish them the very best continued success. I also want to congratulate some young cricketers who they were recently in Antigua in the Leeward Islands under 17 and under 19 training camp, and they would have had some success in getting into one or two of the teams. So I want to congratulate young Carlton Pluck. He's a wicket-keeper batsman, and he has been selected for both the Leeward Islands under 17 and under 19 teams. I also want to congratulate Mr. Light Brown, who has been selected for the Leeward Islands under 17 team, and Omari Jones, who has been selected as a reserve for the Leeward Islands under 17 team. Want to wish them the very best and congratulate them on their selection, and we look forward to seeing great things from them in the future. They have been doing well at very young age, and we look for them to continue to press on. Madam President, I also want to highlight the successful hosting of the St. Kitts Nevis National Athletics Championships, and this would have taken place this past Sunday at the Nevis Athletics Stadium, and to say that this is the first time that the St. Kitts Nevis National Athletics Championships has been held here on Nevis. So I think that is worthy of note. I want to congratulate all of the athletes who took part. Of course, we would have had athletes from the junior level and athletes from the senior level taking part in the championships. And being that this is an Olympic year and we are a few weeks away from the Paris, France Olympics, the National Athletics Championships would have also been the Olympic trials. I haven't gotten all of the results yet, but hopefully when I get those results, I'll know exactly who would have been successful in making the Olympic qualifying standards and who would be going off to represent the federations at the Olympics. Madam President, we commenced our prospective teachers course just yesterday, and we have some 40 young persons who are attending the course, and hopefully over the next 2 weeks they will get the necessary preparations that would assist them in becoming successful teachers once they are successful in getting the job. Also, we are in the month of June, and June is Child Month, and just last week Friday we would have hosted the Child Month, the annual Child Month March, and I know that you're aware of this, Madam President, because I would have seen you in the march. Indeed, I think your pictures are very prominent on Facebook. And Child Month March is something that I think we can all get behind, and Child Month as a whole is something that I think that here in Nevis we should all get behind, because of course the children are the future, and it's always good when we can go out and see the general public coming out to support the youngest children. And these are our infants, the ones who are in daycare, preschool, and those in kindergarten. So the very young and the very vulnerable ones. And we want to show them as much support as possible. So I want to encourage the general public, of course, to continue to support Child Month and to support our young children. One of the best investments we can make as a country is in the well-being and education of our children. Of course, the Department of Education continues to have our final year assessments for the primary schoolers. They are now going through the final assessments for this school year, and our high schoolers also. And those in the school leaving classes, they would have just completed their overseas exams, CXC CSEC and CXC CAPE exams. And I am hopeful that our students, of course, would have done as well or better than they would normally do. In terms of, well, it's the end of the school year, so you know that graduations are just around the corner, and our graduations actually start next week with the preschools, and then the first week in July, we start having our primary school graduations. So for those persons who can, we would ask you to, donate a prize or something to our primary schoolers. It's always good when we can support the young people at graduations. I think the students, they feel better when they know that people care. And so if persons from the general public, could go to the schools and offer a prize, I think that would be greatly appreciated. I try to do it every single year as much as I can. Looking out for the young people, one of the best things that we can do. Madam President, we also do a summer job attachment program through the Department of Youth, and that summer job attachment program that kicks off today. I think the opening ceremony should be happening right now as we are having the house here. And of course, this will be some weeks of preparation for the young people. And then in the month of August, they would be dispatched to various business places for a month-long internship. This is something that we try to do every year to prepare our young people for the world of work. Madam President, that's it for my brief statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I recognize the member for Nevis 3.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I rise to give some brief updates from my ministry as well on the statements by ministers. It is a privilege and honor to do so. As I greet you, Madam President, I greet those on the government side and those on the opposition benches and all who are here today for this important sitting of the Nevis Island Assembly. Madam President, I would want to start on the area of agriculture in that ministry, and I would like to indicate that the Ministry of Agriculture would have hosted our Agriculture Awareness Month during the month of May. We have been doing so now for quite some time, I think for the past 10 years or so. I'm very pleased to say that that initiative would have started when I was the permanent secretary of that ministry, Madam President, and it has been going extremely well for the past years. We would have celebrated Agriculture Awareness Month under the theme, Promoting Sustainable Agriculture for a Resilient Future. And we would have had a number of activities for Agriculture Awareness Month. We would have started with staff devotions at Prospect on the 1st of May to start the month. Madam President, previously we would have done like many others did, and we would have gone to church. What we have done for the past couple of years is that we take church to the ministry. And so, in essence, when you do that, you're assured that all of the staff will be present at the devotion. When you take them to church, some do not come. But when you have it during working hours, all are mandated to be there. And so we had that initiative on the 1st of May. We would have had the minister's address. We would have had a distribution of feed for some of our livestock farmers. We would have heard about the opening of the protected gardens at the Behavioral Health and Wellness Center from Madam Senator, and I'm very proud as well as the Minister of Agriculture that we would have partnered with her ministry in promoting this and ensuring that we do not leave anyone behind, and those who are differently abled mentally, that they are not left out. And I was very proud to see how involved the persons who go to that center were with those grow boxes. And I'm extra proud now to hear that in a very short space of time that they've actually harvested lettuce from those grow boxes. We would have had several open days at the vet clinic as well, and we would have embarked on a series of farmers meetings. We would have had, I think the third year running, a fish pot making workshop. That was done in collaboration with the Department of Gender Affairs. It was hosted at the Jessup's playing field, and once again it was a huge success. Madam President, I think sometimes we underestimate the importance of activities of this nature, because what we have realized is that from these workshops we have now gotten entrepreneurs who are actually making fish pot and doing it as a business. And we have some of our fishermen as well who are involved. What was extremely pleasing to me was to see the number of females who were involved in the fish pot making exercise, not only this year, but last year as well. So I want to commend my ministry, in particular the Department of Marine Resources and Gender Affairs, for once again hosting that workshop. We would have climaxed our month of activities with a staff dinner and award ceremony at the Malcolm Gishard Recreational Park. And I just want to indicate and congratulate the top performers for this year. Our Livestock Farmer of the Year, Miss Idris Morton. Our Crop Farmer of the Year, Godwin Mike Brown. The Protected Agriculture Farmer of the Year, Mr. McLevon Truss. The Fisher of the Year, Mr. Lester Richards. And I also want to highlight the most throughput at the abattoir, Mr. Auricius Jones, because I think ever since we would have started giving this award, Mr. Jones, I think, is the one who would have won it every year. So I want to especially congratulate Mr. Jones as well. We would have hosted our annual Fish Festival. That's the Department of Marine Resources, along with the sponsorship of National Bank, this past Friday, June the 14th, right here at the waterfront in Charlestown. The event was a huge success, and I want to say kudos to the Deputy Director, Mr. Corey Maynard of Marine Resources, and of course to the entire staff, in particular Miss Melissa Allen, manager of the Fisheries Complex, who did an outstanding job. It was well received, very well supported, and we want to thank all who came to support, and we want to say a special thanks as well to National Bank for once again coming on board to be the main sponsor. And of course, the Department of Agriculture, you know, we are always very busy out of one activity into the other. And now we are preparing to host our annual Fruit Festival, and that will be hosted on Friday the 2nd of August. And I just want to indicate here that registration is now open for persons who wish to operate booths during our Fruit Festival for Culturama 50. And now I'm going to turn very quickly, Madam President, to Culturama, because I think that this word Culturama 50 has been on our tongues since last year, and I think the vibes are building and people are all very excited for Culturama 50. And now, Madam President, we are now 38 days away from the start of Culturama 50, and I'm happy to report that plans are progressing very well. Plans are progressing apace. The festival starts officially on the 25th of July, goes until the 6th of August. I'm so excited that I'm giving it extra time. But of course, we know that there has been a number of activities that have been organized prior to the official start of the festival, and they will continue in earnest until we get there to the start and until we get to the finish. And so in terms of our recent events, the Panyard Concert Series, organized by the Nevis Cultural Development Foundation as part of Culturama 50, pre-activities has gone down with a bang. Pan lovers from St. Kitts and Nevis have come out to support the activity. The activity is normally held at the Malcolm Gishard Recreational Park. We have had pan groups, we have had individual pan players from both St. Kitts and Nevis being a part of that activity, that initiative. And the final one, the final in the series, will be held on Sunday, July the 14th. And of course, it will be held once again at the home of that series, the Malcolm Gishard Recreational Park. Last Thursday, the 13th of June, Madam President, as I said, the vibes are certainly building for Culturama 50. And so last Thursday, we had the first in a series of Calypso tents that was hosted at the Old House Cafe right there on Pump Road. And Madam President, I can tell you that for the first tent for this year, it was an excellent turnout. Beyond expectation for the Culturama Committee, beyond expectation for all of us. The Calypsonians were there. They performed well. The turnout was excellent. And I believe the appetite has been whet for the Calypso lovers. I believe we're going to have an extraordinary competition this year. And of course, you're asked to be on the lookout for the rest tents that are coming up very shortly. In terms of upcoming events for Culturama, on Thursday, the 20th of June, that's this Thursday, that's just 2 days from today, the 6 contestants vying for the title of the Miss Culture Queen, the 5 contestants vying for the title of the Miss Culture Swimwear, and the 5 for the the 5 Mr. Cool participants competing for the title of Mr. Cool will be sashed by their sponsors at an in-house private event at the Montpelier Hotel. The Nevis Culturama Committee thanks the title sponsor of the Miss Culture Queen pageant, the Bank of Nevis Limited, along with the individual sponsors, which are the National Bank Group of Companies, Carib Brewery St. Kitts Nevis Limited, Queen City Bar and Garden, Nevis Housing and Land Development Corporation, St. Kitts Nevis Development Bank, and SL Hosfords Limited. The committee also wishes to thank the following sponsors of the Miss Culture Swimwear Contest: Caribbean Lottery, Zanzibar Nevis, Carib Jack Group, Caribbean Digital Displays, the First Federal Credit Union. An equal expression of thanks is extended to the Nevis Tourism Authority, the Nevis Cultural Development Foundation, the Nevis Water Department, the Nevis Culturama Committee, and the Ministry of Agriculture for sponsoring the 5 Culturama 50 Mr. Cool participants. On this coming Friday, June the 21st, Madam President, the Republic Bank Mr. and Miss Talented Youth pageant contestants will be revealed during a much anticipated ceremony at the AL Evelyn Building right here on Main Street in Charlestown. That's right in front of the Nevis Tourism Authority. 6 schools will compete in this year's pageant. They are the Ivor Walters Primary, the Charlestown Primary, the Joycelyn Liebert Primary, the Violet O. Jeffers Nichols Primary, the St. Thomas's Primary, and the Elizabeth Pemberton Primary. The Nevis Culturama Committee expresses its gratitude to the Republic Bank, the title sponsor of this year's pageant, for the increased 50% sponsorship of the prestigious pageant for this year. And so Republic Bank saw it fit to go up, to increase their sponsorship. And this year they're not only doing the sponsorship, and they're also ensuring that the winning school, apart from the participants and the winning participants, the winning school will also be getting some funds to do some work in their respect in that school as well. So thanks to Republic Bank, we would have had the session at the bank this past Thursday. The committee also want to thank the individual sponsors for the schools: Clive Evelyn Construction, Lefco Equipment Rental and Construction Company Limited, National Caribbean Insurance, Nevis Cooperative Credit Union, Odi Brisbane and Grace Foods, and the Nevis Air and Seaports Authority. And so we are inviting all to come out this coming Friday. We know anything that school children are involved in normally generate a lot of interest. And so we're asking you to come out and support the participants this coming Friday when they're revealed in front of the Nevis Tourism Authority building. On Saturday, June the 20th, the National Bank Soca Monarch Teaser number 2 tent will move to the Queen City Bar and Garden from 8 p.m. We have 19 groovy and power soca artists who will be performing their competition songs for the highly anticipated and exciting National Bank Soca Monarch contest, which takes place at the Cultural Village on Thursday, August the 1st. And Madam President, on Tuesday, that's next Tuesday, June the 25th, the Nevis Culturama Committee will host a media conference at 10 a.m. At this conference, the committee will provide updates to the media, make several important announcements, and release the final core and fringe calendar of activities for Culturama 50. This conference will be broadcast live on Vaughan Radio and various social media platforms. That's next week, Tuesday. And finally, in my updates for Culturama, Madam President, update on the venues, because we've heard a lot about the work that has been taking place at our Culturama venues. All major construction is nearing completion at the cultural complex and the cultural village. Tiling, painting, landscaping, and cleanup operations have begun. And the project manager has assured us that both venues will be ready well before the start of Culturama 50. Let me repeat that both venues will be ready on time for the start of Culturama 50. After the construction, vendors, patrons, performers, technicians, security, and medical personnel will enjoy a safe, healthy, and enhanced environment to party and to work during Culturama 50. And I should say as well that the work at NIPAC as well is progressing well, and that event venue as well should be ready on time for Culturama 50. I want once again to encourage all of us to be a part of the festival. Culturama belongs to all of us. It's a milestone. It's a homecoming event. We have already been aware that we'll have thousands who will be descending on the shores of Nevis for the festival, and we are hopeful that it will be a safe and very enjoyable and memorable one. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I recognize the member for Nevis 1.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and good morning, everyone. Good morning to my colleagues on this side of the House, members opposite, to those who are viewing and listening this parliamentary sitting. Madam President, I rise to make what I hope will be some very brief comments as it regards to a number of the ministries or departments that I have responsibility for. I want to start, Madam President, with the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season and its forecast. Madam President, I'm worried. I am worried. The Colorado State University, Madam President, forecasts for 2024 some 23 named storms. 23. The AccuWeather forecasts some 20 to 25 named storms. And NOAA, the National Hurricane Center, forecasts some 17 to 25 named storms. At an average, Madam President, the typical hurricane season, we see an average of some 14 named storms. So from 14 to 23, or from 14 to 20 to 25, or from 14 to 17 to 25 named storms, we must be concerned. The Colorado State University, Madam President, is also forecasting some 11 storms that are above hurricane. The AccuWeather is also forecasting some 8 to 12 named storms, and the NOAA is forecasting some 8 to 13. Again, at an average, we normally see some 7 named storms that are above hurricane. Madam President, here is the worrisome part for me. Major hurricanes. The Colorado State University is forecasting 5. The AccuWeather is forecasting 4 to 7. And NOAA, the National Hurricane Center, is forecasting somewhere between 4 to 7. At an average, we normally see 3 major hurricane named storms. Madam President, I want to put this in context because many first world countries refuse to accept the fact that their actions are putting small island development states at risk. I am not aware, Madam President, of any country in the Caribbean that is significantly contributing to global warming. But the Caribbean territories are on the front line, Madam President, of the wrath of global warming. What are some of the conditions, Madam President, that is creating the kind of environment for the forecast of our 2024 hurricane season? We are seeing, Madam President, near record warm ocean temperatures in the Atlantic and the Caribbean Sea. This creates, Madam President, more energy to fuel storm development. And I believe that in the last few years, Madam President, we have seen tropical storms that develop rapidly because of the warm Atlantic Ocean. And again, Madam President, no island in the Caribbean is contributing to this global warming phenomenon. But we are seeing the brunt, Madam President, of the cause of this global warming. Madam President, we are seeing the development of La Nina condition in the Pacific. And this, Madam President, decreases the wind shear that can weaken or break apart storms in the Atlantic. And why is this such a critical phenomenon, Madam President? It's because that with high wind shear, the hurricanes will not have the opportunity to develop as rapidly as they can. And with the La Nina phenomenon, Madam President, these tropical storms are now, in essence, do not have that obstruction, Madam President, in their development. We are seeing, Madam President, reduced Atlantic trade winds and wind shear. And again, Madam President, the reduction in wind shear allows these tropical storm development to intensify very rapidly. Madam President, we are seeing as well the potential for an above normal African monsoon. And we know from history that whenever a tropical storm rolls off of Africa, the potential for intensification and monster storm, Madam President, is increased. Those development, those conditions, Madam President, are ripe for this hurricane season. And hence, I want the people of Nevis and I want the people of St. Kitts and Nevis and the region to pay keen attention to the 2024 hurricane season. If we weren't paying attention before, I am begging our people, Madam President, to please start paying attention. Madam President, we have been making the necessary preparation. We have seeing the National Disaster Management Committee met on the 9th of April as we seek to prepare ourselves. Madam President, we certainly would have invited God's divine intervention and protection with the Nevis Christian Council prayer service on the 29th of May. And on the 3rd of June, Madam President, there was a similar service on St. Kitts. We have, Madam President, engaged Von Radio to ensure that we have that public awareness notification to the general public. Madam President, we are in the process of ensuring that our flood management system are all in good working order. All of these, Madam President, are efforts as we make the necessary preparation for the 2024 hurricane season. We have looked at our hurricane shelter operations. We have had additional training with our shelter managers. We have completed our shelter inspections. We are also in the process of engaging in some much needed upgrades, Madam President, on some of these hurricane shelters. We have procured, Madam President, our emergency supplies, and I noticed that they have a particular word here, budget, that we have made available the necessary budget, Madam President, for the management of any disaster or emergency during the hurricane season here in 2024. Madam President, of course, we have many guts and waterways throughout the island of Nevis, and we will continue to embark on ensuring that those guts and waterways, Madam President, are cleared, continue to engage the services of our Public Works Department, your fire services, and certainly your volunteers, Madam President, in ensuring that these guts and waterways are cleared. Madam President, I want to say to the island of Nevis, the various hurricane shelters, and I want the various villages to take note as to where these hurricane shelters are. I am hoping that we won't have to use them, but I want our people to know exactly where they are, Madam President. In St. James's, we have the Franklin Brown Community Center and the Butlers Community Center. In St. Thomas's, we have the Jessops Community Center, the Barnesgott Community Center, and the Cotton Ground Community Center. In St. John's, we have the Pond Hill Community Center, the Alberta Payne Community Center. In St. George, Madam President, we have the Charles L. Walters Community Center and the Ebenezer Church of God. And in St. Paul's, Madam President, we have the Girl Guides headquarters. Just a bit of advice, Madam President, to our people. And I want to express how important and how critical it is that our people stay informed, Madam President. Keep updated. Stay informed and keep updated, Madam President, with the weather forecast. I know that there are a lot of online entities that wants to be first. It is one thing, Madam President, to be first. But I want our people to make sure that they get accurate information. Let me say that again. It is all good to be first.
Right.
I don't have a problem with anybody being first. But if you are going to be first, Madam President, I am hoping that the information that you will dispense to the general public, that that information is accurate.
Amen.
I want that information to be accurate, Madam President. I want our people to pay attention to the St. Kitts and Nevis Meteorological Services and the disaster management here in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. Like I said, there are other sources, but please, Madam President, I want our people to get their information from a reputable source. I want to encourage us, Madam President, and I know that perhaps many homes these days do not have battery-powered radios. I must admit that I was also going through my own checklist, and I realized, Madam President, that my own battery-powered radio was out of date. That is to show you, Madam President, how old it was. And I want to encourage our people to make sure that they have battery-powered radios and also make sure that they have batteries, Madam President. Madam President, I want our people to create an emergency plan. Develop a family emergency communication plan. Know where the emergency shelters are located in your area. Know the evacuation routes, Madam President, and certainly I want you to have a plan when it comes to your evacuation. We want you to stock up on essential supplies such as water, non-perishable food, the all-important medications, Madam President, flashlights, batteries, and first aid supply. Madam President, I want our people to make sure that they have enough supplies for at least 72 hours. At least 72 hours, Madam President. And I want our people to ensure, Madam President, that they have a first aid emergency kit. And I believe that once you have a first aid emergency kit, you can go a long way in helping to reduce the stress on our healthcare and our emergency services. Because they, Madam President, would need to be so focused on things that are of critical nature. Madam President, of course, we all know that in hurricanes we seek to protect our property, our homes. Madam President, I want to say as well that I want our people to do their very best to remove a lot of these loose items. Your furniture, your porch furniture. We are seeing, Madam President, a lot of small businesses that are doing a lot of outdoor dining. And I'm saying that let us make sure that we secure all of those outdoor furniture, Madam President, so that they can, or they won't become flying missiles in the event of a hurricane. Madam President, I want to also encourage our people to make sure that their insurance policy is up to date. Make sure that your insurance policy is up to date. And make sure, Madam President, that you do have enough adequate coverage for hurricane. I want to say to our people as well to please participate in local disaster preparedness drills whenever and wherever those drills are enacted. And I want to also say to our people, Madam President, that I know that we all love our pets. We love our pets. Those, Troy, what are those special dogs? And I want us, Madam President, to look after our pets as well. They are, in my mind, a part of the family. So make sure that provisions are made to take care of your loving pets. Madam President, I want to say to our people as well to secure your valuable documents. Secure your valuable documents. Your passport, your land document, your birth certificate, your marriage certificates, those kind of things. Secure them in watertight containers, Madam President, so that if you have to move very quickly, you have those documents at your fingertips, Madam President. And I want to end as it regards to the 2024 hurricane forecast, Madam President. I want to say to all of our people to be our neighbor's keeper. Take care of the elderly, take care of the vulnerable, take care of those persons who are not in the best position to take care of themselves in the event of a hurricane, or any other natural disasters here on the island of Nevis. Look out for each other, Madam President, especially in this 2024 very troubling hurricane forecast. Madam President, I want to turn or move along very quickly to some environmental issues. I believe by now, Madam President, that everyone in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis is aware that the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis is seeking to put an end or ban single-use plastic here in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. It is, Madam President, an initiative that both islands have signed on to. It is an initiative, Madam President, that I believe that is good for our environment and it's good for the image of St. Kitts and Nevis. And in November of last year, Madam President, the Physical Planning Department would have met with the Department of Environment on St. Kitts as we seek to fashion a way forward in ensuring that we bring an end to the use of single-use plastic, Madam President. We also held a meeting in May of this year with the various stakeholders. We would have met with the Health Promotion Unit, the Chamber of Industry and Commerce, Department of Gender Affairs, Nevis Solid Waste Management Agency, Department of Community Development, Department of Sustainable Development, Nevis Tourism Authority, Ministry of Tourism, and the Ministry of Health. Now, Madam President, we have seen the first reading of the single-use or the ban of the single-use act in the federal parliament. And they have sought to outline, Madam President, certain schedules and certain timeline, which is what I really want to highlight to our people here on the island of Nevis. That there is the proposed phase for the banning of single-use plastic here in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. On the 31st of December 2024, there is the proposed ban on the importation of single-use plastics. On the 31st of March 2025, there is a proposed ban on the sale and distribution of single-use plastic. And the second phase, Madam President, the 30th of April 2025, there is the proposed ban on importation of styrofoam, plastic food containers, plastic straws, etc., etc. On the 31st of July 2025, there is the proposed ban and distribution of styrofoam, plastic food containers, plastic straws, etc. And Madam President, on the 31st of August 2025, there is a proposed ban on the importation of single-use plastics, cups, plates, utensils, etc., etc. Now, I have deliberately, Madam President, brought this here in Parliament this morning because I want our people to be mindful of the fact that this is coming. I want our people to appreciate, Madam President, that while we continue to promote a cleaner, more environmentally friendly nation, that there will have to be some radical changes, Madam President, in our thinking when it comes to this kind of material that we import into our federation. I want to say to our people to prepare themselves, be guided accordingly, and ensure that you take the necessary steps to be so guided. We at the Physical Planning Department, and I would here to say, Madam President, with the collaboration and participation of Environmental Health, that we will continue to update and inform our people when it comes to this particular issue, Madam President, of the banning of single-use plastic here in the Federation of St. Kitts and the Nevis. Madam President, I turn very quickly to something that is very near and dear to my heart. I am happy to report, Madam President, that at our last cabinet, the cabinet of the Nevis Island Administration would have given their approval and consent, Madam President, to a road naming policy, road naming and street numbering policy here on the island of Nevis. I want from the outset, Madam President, to thank our legal advisor and the hard-working staff at the legal department. I also want to thank the hard-working staff at the physical planning department and within the ministry as well, disaster management, who would have all contributed, Madam President, to this initiative. It has took some time, Madam President, but like I said before, I don't have an issue with anyone who wants to be first, but our aim, Madam President, is to try and get it right. And Madam President, I want to highlight very quickly just a few areas of this road naming and street numbering policy. The intent of the policy, Madam President, is to establish a road naming and road numbering system for Nevis, which will improve the efficiency of locating a property by use of street number. And I want to pause there because the Senator with responsibility for health would have indicated, Madam President, that there have been some training as it regards to the implementation of our dispatch system here on the island of Nevis. And we do not want to have a situation where the dispatcher have to tell the ambulance that you must go down the road by the big mango tree and go around the corner and you'll see a blue house. No, Madam President. We want to get past that. And I believe that this road naming policy would be instrumental in assisting our first responders, Madam President. Madam President, the intent as well is to clarify the policies regarding addressing new projects, readdressing areas, naming new roads, numbering roads, naming or renaming existing roads, and introducing address signage, Madam President. To establish and clarify the responsibilities for addressing, road naming, road numbering, and signage. To ensure a safer community for facilitating accurate property identification by emergency services. To establish addressing and road naming policies so that there can be more uniformity throughout the island. To ensure names are added to all new proposed subdivisions and previously unnamed roads under construction, Madam President. And Madam President, the idea is to help out everybody when it comes to the accurate identification of the various roads and in our various communities, Madam President. And the objective, Madam President, the naming of new or previously unnamed public roads, changing the name of an existing public road if necessary, and let me put that caveat there, and the naming of private road, Madam President. And Madam President, we are not just doing this as a standalone policy. We are guided by the Local Government Act of 1986. We are also guided by the Nevis Physical Planning Ordinance of 2005 as amended, and we are also guided, Madam President, by the Road Act. All of these, Madam President, will form part of this policy. And the question will be asked, Madam President, well, who will be responsible for this initiative? The Director of Physical Planning and the DAC shall be jointly responsible for the application of this policy. The Director of Physical Planning is responsible for receiving and processing of applications with the guidance of the Development Advisory Committee. And Madam President, in essence, the applications for the naming or renaming of roads will go through our planning department here on the island of Nevis, Madam President. And Madam President, how do we intend for this policy to come into effect? The Director of Physical Planning, Madam President, will give public notice of the assigning or changing of a road or public place name by placing a notice. And that notice will go in the official gazette and our local newspaper, Madam President, press, on the NIA website, and in any other printed or electronic publication in wide circulation in the island of Nevis. And the idea is, Madam President, that when a decision is taken as it regards to the naming of a road or the renaming of a road, that it must be gazetted, it must be published in the various newspapers, it must be placed on the NIA website, and, Madam President, any other electronic publication here on the island of Nevis. And we intend, Madam President, that once such notification is given, once there is a piece of road, Madam President, that is renamed, we intend to advise and inform the Registrar General. We will not leave it by chance. We will inform the Public Works Department, the Inland Revenue Department, the owner or owners of the road, if private, the owners of abutting properties, the Post Office, the Nevis Water Department, NEVLEC, Police, Disaster Office, Ambulance Service and Fire Service, Ministry of Education, Courier Services, Delivery Agencies, supplies of building materials, Madam President. I wanted to highlight those persons who will be notified, Madam President, because we feel that they are our stakeholders in this matter, and we want to make sure that they have the relevant information when it comes to this road naming policy. Madam President, I am very excited about this project because I believe that it will take out of...
Amendment to Section 9, Madam President. The proposed amendment under Section 9 seeks to amend subsection 1 by deleting the words "and have the bank as part of its name" from the paragraph A. While the ordinance caters specifically to international banks, the regulator has sought to expand its applicability to other entities which will function in a similar manner and to be required to comply with all of the requirements under the ordinance. But the strict requirement to have the word bank included in the name of is fairly restrictive. It is the intention to accept applications for licenses under the ordinance from applicants who qualify and satisfy the existing requirements for registration. This will also help with the overall growth of the international banking sector. Amendments to Section 12. Section 12 of the ordinance, Madam President, is amended in subsection 1 to revise the reserve fund requirements of the licensee. The amendment now imposes an obligation on the licensee to maintain a reserve fund, which is required to be 2% of its deposits. The existing provision requires maintenance of a reserve fund in a sum equal to, but not less than 25% of the net profits of the licensee. This requirement, however, was contingent upon the reserve fund being less than the paid-up capital of the licensee in a given year. The new provision removes any requirement for maintenance of the fund based on contingencies and now imposes a set percentage amount to be maintained by the licensee as its reserve fund. Amendment to Section 15, Madam President. Several amendments have been made to this section, which clarify certain other matters under the ordinance, which relate to the validity of a license and certain obligations on the licensee. The existing subsection 3 was deleted and replaced with a new provision, which states that a license issued under the ordinance shall be valid until it is suspended or revoked. This eliminates the concept of the expiration of a license and keeps the license valid unless it is revoked or suspended. Subsection 6, paragraph B, introduces several new requirements to be complied with by a licensee. The new provisions impose additional requirements on a licensee which require the approval of the regulator before certain decisions, particularly involving investments, are made by a licensee. The section is further amended by adding new subsections 11, 12, 13, and 14 immediately after subsection 10. Under the new subsection 11, a licensee is required to submit an annual assessment in the prescribed form, and this assessment is to be accompanied by the non-refundable prescribed fee. This process is to be completed by the licensee on or before the 31st of October in each year. This annual assessment and supporting documents would assist the regulator and ultimately the minister in making a determination as to whether the licensee is compliant with the provisions of the ordinance. In the event of non-compliance, the new annual procedure gives the licensee an opportunity to rectify the deficiencies and areas of non-compliance before punitive measures are undertaken with regards to its license. The new subsection 12, Madam President, outlines the requirement for the provision of all relevant information of a licensee confirming its operational status as required by the regulator. Under the new subsection 13, an administrative penalty shall be applied in the event that a licensee fails to comply with the filing of the annual assessment by the due date of the 31st of October in each year, and that penalty has been set at a flat rate of $25,000. The new subsection 14 provides for the suspension or the revocation of the license in the event that the licensee fails to submit the annual assessment after the expiration of the 90-day period. Amendment to Section 20, Madam President. Section 20, subsection 1, is amended by adding a new paragraph G immediately after paragraph F. This new provision imposes an obligation on the licensee to seek the approval of the regulator before it undertakes any large exposure, which has now been defined in the amendment to Section 2 that we spoke of earlier of the principal ordinance. The regulator must be made aware of this plan on the part of the licensee and be given an opportunity to assess the possible risk involved, which may possibly affect the financial soundness of the licensee. Amendments to Section 22, Madam President. The amendment under Section 22, subsection 5, amends the provision to capture the new definition of senior management introduced under Section 2 of the bill. The requirement of the licensee to obtain the written approval of the regulator prior to any such appointment is maintained. A new subsection 6 was inserted immediately after subsection 5, which imposes an administrative penalty in the sum of $500 per day in the event of failure on the part of the licensee to comply with the provisions of subsection 5. This seeks to ensure compliance by a licensee of its obligations under the ordinance. Amendment of Section 34, Madam President. Section 34 of the ordinance is amended by adding a few new subsections immediately after the existing subsection 6. The new subsection 7 addresses the matter of the appointment of an auditor by the licensee. The licensee is not at liberty to appoint an auditor who is unqualified and does not meet the requirements of the ordinance to undertake an audit of the licensee. This subsection requires the approval of the auditor by the regulator in advance of the auditor accepting the engagement from the licensee. Any auditor who is considered for appointment must be satisfactory to the regulator, and the regulator is required to consider certain factors before making a determination regarding the appointment of the auditor. The new subsection 8 gives the regulator authority to appoint an auditor which is satisfactory to the regulator after the auditor, who is recommended by the licensee, is found to be unsatisfactory to the regulator. When the regulator exercises this discretion to appoint an auditor, then that expense will be borne by the licensee. It is not prudent to have the licensee's business remain unaudited on account of the absence of an auditor or failure on the part of the licensee to appoint an auditor. The new subsection 9 makes it clear that any member of the senior management team is precluded from being appointed as an auditor of the licensee. The new subsection 10 makes it clear that any person who functions as an auditor of the licensee and then subsequently joins the management team or is appointed to the board is required to cease functioning as an auditor of the licensee. This is to prevent any conflicts of interest with the multiple functions with that individual would be expected to perform within the licensee. Amendment to Section 35, Madam President. Section 35 of the ordinance was amended to make provision for the power of suspension in addition to the power of revocation already included under that section. Accordingly, the relevant subsections 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9 were amended to capture this new power. So, Madam President, that gives us a synopsis of the amendments that we are now tabling here today in Parliament. And, of course, it's quite a number of amendments, but we thought it fit as an administration to make these amendments, bearing in mind that we are trying as much as possible to attract more international banks to our jurisdiction. And, Madam President, may it please you.
There's a motion on the floor for the second reading. The member would have explained the objects and reasons. So is there a seconder?
Madam President, I rise once again to lend my support to the Nevis International Banking Amendment Bill 2024. Second the motion, Madam President. And
Now you can lend your support. Yes.
I will say no voice behind you. Madam President, I rise to second the bill, Madam President, and to, with your leave, make my brief contribution, Madam President. And Madam President, I want to highlight just a few areas of the bill that is before this Honorable House, and in particular, amendment to Section 2. And Madam President, the mover of the bill spoke about the amendment to Section 2. And what the amendment sought to do, Madam President, is to insert a few paragraphs. And I want, Madam President, to highlight Section A of that insertion, Madam President. And with your leave, Madam President, I would read it into the record of this House. Section C. Any other individual who performs substantive function similar to those performed by a person referred to in paragraph A, and I will get back to paragraph A, as determined by the regulator upon examination of the licensee, organizational chart and position, description, or job specification. And Madam President, why is that section important and critical? Let us look at what Section A is proposing. Section A, Madam President, speaks to the functions of the Chief Executive Officer. It speaks to the function of the Chief Operating Officer, the President, the Vice President, Corporate Secretary, etc., etc. Now, Section C, Madam President, is saying to all those who are paying attention, if it is that the Chief Executive Officer may have deferred their function to anybody else or to someone else in the organization, those responsibilities, Madam President, must now be captured under this legislation. So if someone is within that organization making, as it were, Chief Executive Officer's decision, they must now be captured under these amendments, Madam President. And I thought that that was important because perhaps at times decisions are being made that should have been made by a Chief Executive Officer or a President or a Chief Operating Officer, and those decisions may have now been made by someone who does not necessarily hold the title of a Chief Executive Officer, Madam President. Those decisions and those procedures will now be captured in Section C of these amendments, Madam President. Madam President, another section that I want to highlight, and I went to the parent Nevis International Banking Ordinance Bill, amendment to Section 12. Amendment to Section 12, Madam President. Section 12 of the Principal Ordinance is amended by deleting 1 in its entirety and replacing it with the following. A licensee shall maintain a reserve fund which is equivalent to 2% of the total deposits. I want you to keep that 2% figure in mind. And what the parent ordinance states, Madam President, in Section 12 of the parent ordinance, which speaks to maintenance of reserve fund. Subject to subsection 2, a licensee shall maintain a reserve fund and shall, out of its net profits of each year and before any dividend is paid, transferred the fund of sum equal to not less than 25% of those profits whenever the amount of the reserve fund is less than the paid-up capital of the licensee. Now, Madam President, why is this amendment important? And why is it critical? The bank can say that for 2024, I make $1 million profit. And if my math is correct, based on the 25% deposit, that would be $250,000. You will be transferred. But now, Madam President, the amendment is saying that your reserve fund must be 2% of the total deposits. And why is that important? Because, Madam President, a bank can now have a reserve, a bank can now have a deposit of $20+ million. So the 2% is now calculated on the $20 million. So your reserve fund, Madam President, moved from $250,000 if you made $1 million profit to $400,000 based on your total deposit. Why is that important, Madam President? That is important, Madam President, because it is now saying to these institutions that you must have more skin in the game. Your reserve fund must now cover your entire deposit. And it must be a portion which is now 2% of your total deposit, Madam President. It means that you must show clearly, Madam President. And there is no monkey business now in the numbers, because your total deposit will be clear. Because you have to disclose what your total deposit is. With your profit, you can. So now, Madam President, your reserve fund is calculated from your total deposit. And I thought, Madam President, that that captures the true reflection of what the reserve fund must be, Madam President. Madam President, I want to turn very quickly to the amendment to Section 20. And this, I believe, is also important. The amendment to Section 20. And Section 20 amendment, Madam President, adds a new paragraph. And I like the paragraph. Section G speaks to, let me look at the parent. Section 20, Madam President, very quickly. It speaks to doing business without the approval of the regulator. And why is that important, Madam President? That is important because we are saying to these international banks, there may be time when you want to do certain investment with persons' deposit. And now the regulator must now play a part in terms of how you deal with those deposits, Madam President. I believe that it is a good addition when it comes to the amendment because it gives some protection in terms of how these banks now treat persons' deposit, Madam President. And I would hope that the regulator would be empowered, Madam President. I would hope that once these kind of matters is presented before the regulator, that the regulator must be provided, and it's a suggestion, must be provided with a sound investment plan of people's deposit. Can't tell me that you want to take up somebody $10 million and do what you want to do with it and there is no sound investment plan. The regulator must, in my humble submission, Madam President, should be provided with that kind of information. Must be sound. And the regulator must be empowered, Madam President, with the necessary tools and mechanisms to function. Finally, Madam President, I want to look at amendment to section 34. And the amendment to section 34, Madam President, make 4 additions. And I want to look at 8 and 9. If a licensee fails to appoint an auditor satisfactory to the regulator, then the regulator may, at the expense of the licensee, appoint an auditor for the licensee to conduct an audit in accordance with this section. I kind of like it. You know why? Because there ought not to be now, Madam President, any obstruction as to why any entity ought not to be audited. If there is a delay for an audit, and the delay continue to be extended and extended and extended, it is now within the regulator powers to appoint an auditor. And I am very much encouraged, Madam President, by this addition and this section. Section 9 speaks to senior management of the licensee shall not be eligible for appointment as an auditor of the licensee. Madam President, that is self-explanatory. I don't need to elaborate on that, but I will read it again. I will read it again. Senior management of the licensee shall not be eligible for appointment as an auditor of the licensee. And I will leave it there, Madam President. Madam President, I want to wish this bill safe passage through this honorable House, and I want to congratulate the member for Nevis number 3. For Nevis number 3, for presenting his first, let me see how I should put it, Madam President, for presenting his first piece of legislation in the capacity as Minister of Finance. May it please the Madam.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any other contributions to the bill? I recognize the Honourable Member for Nevis 4.
Madam President, it's now good afternoon. Good afternoon to you, to the honorable members present, to all in the gallery, and all viewing and listening. Madam President, I rise to make my contribution to the Nevis International Banking Amendment Bill 2024. We are aware, Madam President, that the international banking industry in Nevis is growing. We see the Nevis International Banking Ordinance replacing the Nevis Offshore Ordinance, and as indicated earlier, this can be considered an emerging sector, and some of the amendments presented here today has to do with trying to minimize ambiguity and to provide stricter compliance. Madam President, we have seen that the number of international banks licensed to operate in our jurisdiction are increasing, and as an emerging industry, we expect that this sector is likely to continue in that direction, provided that the regulatory framework espouses the principles of good governance. We are aware that there are currently 6 international banks, and as indicated by the Minister for number 3, we have 3 new banks in the last 6 months. And so I commend the presenter for recognizing the growth and the need to enhance the legislative framework to encourage the development of that area. We are aware also that monitoring and regulating the activities of our international banks are to be in accordance with the Basel Core Principles, which is an international standard in banking that governs the licensing and supervision of these entities. The Nevis International Banking Ordinance, I find it necessary to make reference to this, was designed to enable international banking to be carried on by international banks from within Nevis and to encourage the development of Nevis as a responsible international financial center. The banking legislation is supposed to ensure that a bank license under the legislation can be properly monitored to safeguard depositors' funds and ensure that the bank maintains acceptable accounting standards and satisfies capital requirements. In light of the foregoing, Madam, amendments were proposed to Section 8, and the amendment to Section 8 speaks to amendments to subsection 2. If we look at the ordinance, the existing ordinance, Section 8, captioned by the heading Issue of License, while Section 2 has been deleted and the new Section 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 added, subsection 1, Madam President, says that the minister shall not issue a license under this ordinance to any person other than an eligible company or qualified foreign bank. Madam, in light of the intent to minimize ambiguity, I think this is an area that should also have been amendment to add as determined by the regulator, because we have seen in different areas where the minister's action is dependent on a recommendation or consultation with the regulator. If we look at Section 13 on page 13 of the ordinance, we would see Section 1, on receipt of an application for a license under this ordinance, the minister shall direct the regulator to conduct an investigation of the applicant, its financial circumstances, and any associates or affiliates of the applicant as the minister considers necessary in the public interest, as the minister considers necessary. Madam, if we look at Section 30 of the ordinance, Section 3, and again, this is an attempt to minimize ambiguity. Under Section 30, Section 3, the regulator shall have the power to, and subsection E says to examine and make recommendations to the minister with respect to applications for licenses. And so since this is a responsibility and a duty of the regulator, I think to minimize ambiguity, Section 8.1 could be amended as indicated based on the recommendation of the regulator. Madam Chair, the amendment to Section 9 says that the bank, the name bank does not have to be included in the name of the international institution. But Madam, President, when we look at the purpose of the Nevis International Banking Ordinance, which states an ordinance to repeal and replace the Nevis Offshore Banking Ordinance with the Nevis International Banking Ordinance 2014 to enable international banking to be carried on by international banks from within Nevis, and it goes on. And while it was expressed that the name bank is being proposed to be removed from the name of the institution because institutions are likely to have a broader scope, then perhaps an amendment can be made to speak to the different names that may be considered. Because to have an institution that is involved in international banking, regulated by the Nevis International Banking Ordinance, and does not have the name bank in it, can lead to ambiguity. And I think that there are other ways to address new and emerging institutions that may not want to be considered banks. Madam President, if we look at Section 17 of the Ordinance, 1A, Section 17, 1A, misleading name, it speaks to misleading name. And 17, 1A says that the minister may refuse to grant a license or revoke a license already issued if in his opinion the applicant or the licensee, as the case may be, is carrying on or intends to carry on international banking business under a name which, A, can mislead or confuse the persons for whom it intends to provide any or all of its services. And so, Madam President, based on what is presented, the ordinance clearly sets out to try to minimize ambiguity, to try to minimize the confusion of persons by having a misleading name. Then, Madam President, probably an alternative route to addressing the emerging institutions could be considered. Madam President, the amendment to Section 15, subsection 3 of the ordinance, where there is no need for renewal license. However, it indicates that each year a fee would have to be paid. I am not quite sure that I fully understand the need to make that separation. If each year a licensing fee has to be paid, but it is not called a renewal of license, that area is not quite clear, Madam President, as to what the authors are trying to accomplish. Madam President, the amendment proposed to Section 22 to add a section, subsection 6, where it says adding a director or senior management, amendment to Section 22. Yes. Where it says Section 22, subsection 6, a licensee who appoints a director or other senior management without the written approval of the regulator shall be liable to an administrative penalty of $500 per day. And I would like to see, Madam President, some justification regarding $500 per day, because even if we look at the responsibilities of directors and senior managers and what they can effectuate within a day, or 5 days, or 10 days, it could be a significant benefit to the institution. And so this penalty may not have the desired effect to deter institutions from appointing directors or senior management without the approval of the regulator. And so I do feel that a higher penalty would be more effective in ensuring that we address the necessary appointments proactively rather than at the back end. Madam President, the amendment to Section 34, subsection 8, this is a new insert. If a licensee fails to appoint an auditor satisfactory to the regulator, then the regulator may, at the expense of the licensee, appoint an auditor for the licensee to conduct an audit. Madam President, as indicated earlier by the Minister for number 1, where we can see financial institutions not submitting the necessary audited reports because they have difficulty in finding an auditor. And so in number 8, where it says that the regulator may, at the expense of the licensee, I think it should be within a certain time period. If the institution cannot find an auditor, then the regulator shall, at the expense of the licensee, appoint an auditor. And again, this is, I think, would help to minimize ambiguity. I do agree that the international banking sector is an emerging area, and we would want to encourage compliance as much as possible at the onset. Madam President, I received this bill, proposed amendments, and I was somewhat disappointed that there was no consideration given to amendments to Section 30. Section 30 of the ordinance. Section 30 of the ordinance, Madam President, speaks to the regulator of international banking. And it points out the duties of the regulator. Madam President, just last year, the High Court judge ruled in favor of an international bank against the regulator of international banking. And looking at what was required for the International Banking Department to repay, based on the fact that the authority was not expressly presented in this section, it would appear to me that some amendments would have been made, especially to subsection 2, that speaks to the duties to ensure the proper compliance of licensees with the provisions of this ordinance and the powers conferred upon the regulator. And Madam President, as we look through this area, you would see powers to supervise the licensees, You see powers to examine or cause an examination. You see powers to assist in the investigation of any contravention, to examine accounts and audited financial statements. And then, Madam President, as you look further for the duties of the regulator in subsection 4, to verify compliance with provisions of this ordinance by a licensee. It speaks to having access to the registered office, to require the directors, officers, and auditors to provide information. The regulator is required to keep abreast of developments. However, Madam President, I think that it would have been useful, considering what transpired at the High Court in 2023, that some amendments would have been made to this section. Now, it is clear, Madam President, that Section 11 of the regulations speak to fixed penalties and gives the regulator the authority to process these fixed penalties. That is clearly spelled out in the regulations. However, the lack of authority to issue cease and desist and fines, as expressed under Section 30, is something that I think should be looked at. Under Section 77 of the ordinance, Madam President, I think it would be instructive as we try to minimize ambiguity, enhance compliance, and to encourage the emerging industry, that I think, it can be stated differently, but under Section 70 that speaks to unlicensed international banking, 77, yes. 7, Section 77, subsection 1. Under this section, it says a licensee who does international banking from within Nevis during any period in which he does not hold a license under this ordinance commits an offense and is liable to a fine not exceeding $250,000. And Madam President, I'm just seeking for clarification as to whether or not the regulator would have the authority to pursue a case under this section, as it is not clearly stated as it is under the regulations, which says specifically that the regulator has the authority to process fixed penalties. I am not certain if these would be considered fixed penalties, but under the offenses listed in Section 77, it does not clearly indicate. Subsection 4 speaks to the High Court may order any profits derived from the conduct of international banking from within Nevis without a license under this ordinance to be forfeited to the administration. However, because of what we would have seen transpired and based on the authority given to the regulator not being expressed in that section, I'm just seeking, Madam President, whether or not it would not lend more clarity to the ordinance if amendments can be made to clearly indicate where the regulator has authority. Madam President, one of the cause for major concern, I think, with regards to the International Banking Ordinance is when we saw that the High Court ruled against the regulator. And then we saw that the International Bank sought to be awarded 100 million US dollars for damages. Madam President, our gross national income is way below this figure. And I am not certain if the judge has ruled in that regard yet. But, Madam President, there must be some concern about if the ordinance has loopholes and a judgment comes against the NIA, how are we prepared to deal with such actions? And as we try our best efforts to grow the industry, I would want us to ensure that we consider the unexpected and we consider the various scenarios and whether or not our ordinance can be amended or strengthened to ensure that while we are trying to assist an emerging industry, that we ourselves are not being exposed to the types of legal action that could have detrimental impacts to an industry that has been serving us well over the years, and we would want to see it serving us well for many more years to come. And so, Madam President, as I wrap up, we are aware of the importance of having effective legislation that has the necessary teeth to enforce and to obtain the intent of the regulations. Madam President, I think that we must try to minimize the ordinances that are not enforceable, or ordinances that have loopholes that can be to our detriment. And so, Madam President, I would like to encourage consideration of some of the ideas that were made so that we can help to make Nevis progressive, sustainable, and minimize the backlash that we may get. I beg your leave. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for your contribution. I recognize the Honourable Member for Nevis 5.
Good afternoon, Madam President,
Good afternoon.
members on the government side, member opposite, clerk of the House, Sergeant of the Arms, members in the public gallery, as well as those listening and viewing via the internet and other media houses. Madam President, I rise on this occasion to make my contribution to the bill entitled A Bill to Amend the Nevis International Banking Ordinance. Madam President, I have looked at the 9 proposed amendments, or the amendments to 9 sections of the International Banking Ordinance. And I must say, Madam President, that I take no serious issues with the proposed amendments. I do believe that the intention of the draftsman in assisting to somewhat ensure robust compliance with our international banking sector, as well as compliance with other international regulations and policies and other international bodies such as FATF. I believe that the attempt to ensure robust compliance as well as good governance and best practices, the objective was somewhat achieved, Madam President. However, I do have perhaps one recommendation, and it is against the backdrop or within the context that we are now seeing significant developments in the area of the international banking sector or the offshore sector, so to speak. Madam President, the mover of the bill indicated that we now have 6 international banks that are licensed to operate in Nevis. He did not make mention as to the types of international bank, but based on my research, I believe that we do have 2 traditional retail international banking banks, as well as a merchant bank. And I believe that the others that we saw within the last 6 months, and I stand free to be corrected if that is not the case, are perhaps more leaning towards the side of private international banking, or what is coined in the industry as family banking. And so, with this in mind, and within this context, I believe that there is a need for us to seriously look at the substantial legislation, and that is the Nevis International Ordinance, or for short, NIA. Madam President, as we sit here this afternoon with these proposed amendments, I must say that perhaps as legislature, we are to consider that the time has come for us to consider repealing NIA. If it is, Madam President, and as the mover has indicated, that we are seeing rapid growth and development and interest in this particular area of international banking, he mentioned that just within the last 6 months, there were 3 additional licenses granted. Now, Madam President, if it is that within 6 months you have 3 additional licenses granted to international banks, one can perhaps see a trend where in the very near future, and perhaps by the end of the year, we will have significantly more license, more applications being made for license to be issued for more international banks. So it is perhaps prudent and taking a more purposive approach and being proactive, Madam President, I wish to recommend to this Honorable House that perhaps the time has come to completely look at NIBO in its entirety, simply to avoid us having to conduct this exercise of coming to this house to have amendments on occasions where there is rapid development, but those developments do not necessarily sync with the existing legislation. If it is that we all as stakeholders, and particularly more so the government, that we are using this avenue as a means of diversifying our economy. And I do believe, Madam President, that the good folks at the financial services, as well as other private investors and stakeholders, that great efforts are being made to push this particular industry. Madam President, I commend those efforts. However, we have to be sensible, practical in our approach, because, Madam President, whilst the industry is a very lucrative industry, and I know that from my experience as a banker, we must be mindful that the industry itself presents a number of risks, and risks that can have significant adverse impact on our banking sector as well as our reputation, both locally and internationally. So, Madam President, I just wish to propose that efforts are to be made to look at the product itself, whether the focus is going to be on retail international banking or private international banks, which seem to be the trend now. And having had discussions with the regulator of international banking, I do believe that there should be an overhaul of this legislation to include a legislative framework that will do justice not only to the existing products or licenses that have been issued, but those that we can envision if we are taking a visionary approach to this particular industry that would arise in the near future. Madam President, looking at the proposed amendments, initially, I did have an issue, I must admit, with the amendment for Section 12 of the main ordinance. And Section 12, subsection 1 is being amended where a licensee shall maintain a reserve fund which is equivalent to 2% of its total deposit. Madam President, I wish to say that I do understand the need for this particular amendment. I believe, Madam President, in the past, there has been challenges with the existing Section 12, where licensee often would have objections, Madam President, and then there would be debates and discussions and sometimes arguments and perhaps ambiguity where you have to determine the profit margin of the licensee. So to see that condition now being taken away and you now have one qualifying condition or factor, I believe that it is a step in the right direction. Madam President, it is important in this industry to have reserves in addition to the requirement for the initial capital reserve at startup. The international banking industry is not an easy industry. It's not easy to manage. It's not easy to regulate, Madam President. I know that from experience. And one of the challenges that we may find that would exist in this particular industry is the fact that when banks are being onboarded, a lot of times the licensee would meet the onboarding requirements. All of the documents would be in order, and therefore it is very easy to onboard. But the challenge comes, Madam President, with ongoing monitoring. And that is where I believe we have most of our challenges. And that is where I believe, Madam President, the onus is on us as a country to ensure that we have ongoing compliance, not only with our own local legislation, but with international legislation and policies. Now, Madam President, just to give a particular example, the member for Nevis 4 mentioned a matter within the courts where the regulator of international banking was subject to legal challenges by a licensee. Madam President, to some extent, that resulted in significant damages either being paid or have to be paid by the government based on certain conduct and also based on certain weaknesses within the legislation. We ought to be mindful that we must learn from our experiences. It is very important for us to do so. And so therefore, the approach that I am recommending must be an all-inclusive, purposeful approach. It appears that the approach that is being taken now is to amend the legislation to adapt to particular situations whenever there is a need to onboard a particular bank or to issue a particular license. I am simply proposing that that is not prudent and it is not sufficient. Madam President, in this particular industry that is fast growing, that is proposed significant risk exposure to corruption, money laundering, and even within the banks themselves, Madam President, where they face risks of dealing with multiple currencies, particularly if we are dealing with retail banks or even merchant banks. Madam President, this industry is vulnerable. And in order for us to make it sustainable, to meet our needs here in Nevis, the onus is on us to ensure that our legislative framework is sufficiently robust, not just for today, not just to meet a particular situation or to onboard a particular customer. It must be sufficiently robust for future generations to come. Madam President, when NIBO was first introduced, I believe, I don't remember the specific date, could have been 1996, 99, back in the 90s, Madam President. Many of us, and I believe I am old enough to say us, had to think about that for a minute, Madam President. And those past, our forefathers, perhaps could not envision a situation where Little Nevis, 36 square miles, is now at the stage where we have 6 international banks. Madam President, that is a significant accomplishment and something that we all must be proud, not fearful, but proud, because it tells us that people out there, private investors, have an interest in our little island, not just for the purposes of tourism, not just for CBI, Madam President, but they want to do private banking with us. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing, it is commendable, and all of us should welcome it. However, in order for us to have confidence that the product would be sustainable, that the product itself would minimize risk, that it would not cause us to become blacklisted or grey-listed or listed at all, Madam President, it is very, very crucial that we take the necessary steps not to have piecemeal amendments, but to have a comprehensive look at this particular legislation. We must ensure and ask ourselves whether it is meeting the needs and requirements that the industry is now on a drive, and it is a fast drive, almost a highway, when you look at the speed of the applications and the license being granted, whether we have the necessary tool and legislative framework to encompass this new opportunity. So, Madam President, with that recommendation on the table, and I hope that it will be taken with much favor and it would not be seen as a criticism, Madam Legal Advisor, that we can work together as stakeholders to ensure that we are ready to embrace this new opportunity on our shores, that we are ready to compete with jurisdictions such as Cayman Islands, that we are ready and equipped to ensure that we can maximize as a country on the opportunities, the economic opportunities that would derive and have been deriving from this particular sector. Madam President, having said that, I wish to commend my colleagues, that is, the persons who would have been instrumental in drafting these amendments. I do believe it would have been done by an attorney, and that is the reason why I use the word colleague, Madam President, just for clarification. Yes. So I am not opposed to it. And so, Madam President, I wish to also acknowledge and thank the legal department as well as the staff at the financial services for their hard work and also for their inclination to see that there is need for us to be more diligent and to be more robust in the application of our legislative framework to ensure that risk is minimized in this particular industry. I thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I do reserve some time to speak briefly on the adjournment. Grateful, Madam President.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I recognize the honorable nominated member.
President, good afternoon. Madam President, with your leave, I rise to make a brief intervention on the bill before this honorable House. And I intend to be brief because I'm happy that everybody has supported the bill so far this afternoon. That is something that I think that's very good, because the Nevis International Banking Ordinance is something that is good for all of us here in Nevis. I'm very happy that I was here back in 2014 when we first brought the bill before this honorable House. Madam President, the thing about it, like with any industry or anything that you want to start, any new thing, as you go along, you're gonna realize that there is a need to evolve. Okay? And the international banking industry is no different. I remember, I think in the past, before this bill, that for offshore banks to be licensed in our jurisdiction, that offshore bank had to be affiliated with another local bank. So what this ordinance did was to change that, to open up the field, as it were, so that you didn't have to be tied to an already existing local bank to become an international bank. So it allowed us here in Nevis to really take advantage of, pretty much the entire world around us. People who wanted to be involved in international banking, who could come, present their plan, present themselves, and who met the threshold according to the law of the type of persons who could actually, or the type of entities that could actually carry out international banking. So it's been an evolution. The amendments that we are proposing today are also a part of that evolution. After having dealt with growing number of international banks, I think I heard that we now have 6 international banks, and 3 of them have come only in the last few months. So it's a growing industry. And so in order to deal with this growing industry, we have to make the necessary changes. And I'm happy that the government recognizes this, and I'm happy that those on the opposition also recognize. And of course, we also take on board the recommendations that have come from the members opposite, because I don't believe that any of us think that we are all-knowing and that the things that we do are perfect. We are open to suggestions, and we are open to improvement. That is, of course, the reason why we are here. I had quite a bit of notes prepared on, thought I would have gone through bit by bit on all of the amendments, but I don't want to do that because of the time and also because of the fact that the members opposite have come, and for the most part, they have agreed that there is need for amendment, and that indeed most of the amendments being proposed are good. I will, however, touch one thing that was said by the member for Nevis 4, that where did I make the notes? Yes. Where it speaks to the minister being the one to license the banking institutions. And I think the recommendation was that it be subject to the auditor advising the minister. The regulator, advising the minister. I think that it's not necessary to put it in that particular section. Section 8, I think that is. Because it's already spoken about in section 30. 30E. Yeah. Yes. Already spoken about in section 30E. And that is part of the job of the regulator, to provide that advice to the minister. But I don't think it's necessary to place it into section 8, where it makes the minister subject to the advice of the regulator. I do not believe that is prudent or necessary. Madam President, I like the fact that we have made the amendment, and somebody will tell me exactly we did it, because I have so much notes here, that we have made the amendment that it is not necessary to renew the license every single year once the entities are in compliance. And we could see how that would help the entities, would help the banks. Because if I was somebody who wanted to do business with a bank, I would want to know that this bank, that one, they have a license, that two, they can operate, and that three, that my money would be in an entity that is safe. Now, having that requirement where every single year the bank has to come and actually go and renew the license, or they can't operate, that could put, some sort of doubt in the minds of persons who would want to put money into that institution. Of course, the legislation has made up for it, where once there is that stipulation that the bank has to remain in compliance, and the regulator, the regulator has the power, according to the amendment, to, I think, suspend the license of the bank if they fall out of compliance. I think the bank has to I think we're under section 8, right? Yes. They have to pay up their license fees and all of that by October 1st. So it's not actually a full requirement to come out and renew the license of the bank every year. Once you have the license, you have the license. And the bank only loses that license if they fall out of compliance. as opposed to the bank having a license for 1 year and then having to go now and put forward again to renew the license. I think that protects the banks themselves from, how would I refer to it? Maybe the changes in politics, because you never know. Sometime in the future there could be changes, and I think that's a protection that we have there for the bank, because suppose member for Nevis 3, who is the acting Minister of Finance, is here as the Minister of Finance now, and he of course has no reason not to reject the application of the bank. But what if by, some reason the Minister of Finance becomes somebody else, and that person, for whatever reason, doesn't feel like they want to sign off on the license? So it provides that protection for the bank. So I think that is another step in the right direction in terms of our amendments. So I'm trying to find a few things that were not highlighted before, because based on the other presentations that we have had, we've pretty much gone through most of the bill. I thought that was something that needed to be highlighted and was not said before by any of the other presenters. So, Madam President, I think the whole idea is to ensure that our banking sector, that our international financial institutions are on a solid footing here on Nevis, so that we already have 6, but we would encourage, or we would attract other entities. We would let them know that we have a safe and secure regulatory framework or regulatory space within which they could all operate. Yes, that we have a very stable jurisdiction. So we take all of the criticisms on board, and of course I think we would continue to work on the legislation, because it is of course evolving as the whole market, as the whole financial framework continues to evolve. So who knows, maybe in 5 years or 10 years, we might have 20 or 30 institutions. The whole jurisdiction would have grown, and there might be need for other amendments. So until such time, Madam President, I want to wish the bill safe passage to this honorable House, and may it please you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Recognize the member for Nevis 3.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I rise to wind up the debate on the bill before this honorable House. And Madam President, I just want to say thank you to all who made contributions to the bill. 2 contributions on this side and the 2 contributions from the opposite side. And I must say from the onset as well, Madam President, that I particularly like the tone of the House today, because we got some excellent recommendations and suggestions from the 2 members opposite. And this is what we should do when we come into this honorable House. You know, the Nevis International Banking Ordinance is something that can benefit the entire island. And whether you support the government or whether you support the opposition, I think it is always good when we can come in and make good suggestions and recommendations. I really want to thank the two members opposite for the very good suggestions that were made today. Of course, I think based on the contributions that we heard from both the government side and the opposition side, I think the consensus is that the amendments are in order. And of course, there can be more amendments. But it is important that when we're looking at an important sector as the international banking sector, that we ought to strengthen our regulation. We ought to now and again have a look at the legislation, have a look at the ordinance, and see where we can strengthen. Of course, it's important that we strengthen the loopholes or take the loopholes out and strengthen the legislation. We must have good oversight, we must have good regulation, and I think that that is the intention of having this amendment bill brought to this Honorable House today. And so once again, I want to thank those who would have made contributions to the bill. I just wanted to respond quickly, though, to some of the suggestions and recommendations that were made from the opposition. The member for Nevis 4 spoke about an amendment, a possible amendment for Section 8, and I think the Senator Liburd would have already spoken to that, where there are several other sections in the bill where the regulator has the authority to give recommendations to the minister. So in essence, you have those other subsections, so there's absolutely no need to change Section 8. There was also the comment about the removal of the word bank. And the real reason behind the removal of the word bank is really to broaden the scope of the entities that we are trying to attract to this jurisdiction. And it doesn't limit in any way the activity of these institutions. And we have to recognize as well that we have to try as much as possible to be as international in terms of our standards, because there are certain institutions like, for example, Chase and JP Morgan that do not have bank attached to those institutions. And so we are just trying as much as possible to be as creative as possible where this is concerned. In terms of the removal of the licensing renewal, we also, the intention here as well is to streamline the licensing process. And in terms of the fee of the $500 per day, we take on board your suggestion, but however, the fees that we are talking about here, they are in US dollars. So the 500 actually is in US dollars. But we still take on board, well, I don't know whether or not your rate was US, but we still take on board the issue of probably increasing the fees. The member for Nevis 5 spoke about the repealing of NIBO, and I think down the road, the intention is to repeal and replace the ordinance. However, that will be a more comprehensive and time-consuming process and initiative, but there were some urgent need to do some amendments to the bill right now, to the ordinance right now, bearing in mind that we are attracting new business to the jurisdiction, and so there was the need for us to do some urgent amendments to the parent ordinance. Of course, you would have said it is a vulnerable sector, which we are all aware of, and we must be robust. And I guess that is why we are here, Madam President. We must be robust, and that is why we are here, in essence, to make the amendments to the ordinance. Of course, I would encourage the two members opposite. As I said, we take on board your suggestions, but I would also encourage you, because even though we have come and made these amendments today, that does not mean we cannot make amendments in the future, even before we repeal and replace the existing ordinance. And so I would encourage you, when you have suggestions, to dialogue with the Minister of Finance, to dialogue with our regulation department, and we will be happy to take those on board and probably come and do some further amendments. But Madam President, as I said, I'm happy that we would have gotten some very good suggestions and excellent presentation, contributions from both sides of the House today. And so I am pleased to have been given the honor to present this piece of legislation today. And with that said, I want to wish it safe passage to this honorable House. And while I'm on my feet, Madam President, I would suggest a 10-minute recess before we go into committee stage. May it please you, Madam President.
Before, what I'll do then, I'll put the question, we'll take the vote on it, and we'll take a short suspension after that of the House. So the question is that the bill shortly entitled the Nevis International Banking Amendment Bill 2024 be read a second time. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Indulgence, please.
A bill to amend the Nevis International Banking Ordinance, Cap 7.05, bracket end, and for matters related thereto or connected therewith.
The bill has been read a second time. The House will move into committee stage after a suspension of the House for 5 minutes. Thank you. The House is suspended.
please be seated.
Thank you for your patience. The House is now in committee stage.
Clauses 3 to 9.
The question is that clauses 3 to 9 form part of the bill. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Clause 10.
In clause 10, we are proposing an amendment to clause 10. That should read in section 8, clause 10. If a licensee fails to appoint an auditor satisfactory to the regulator within 6 months of the licensee's financial year end, then the regulator shall, instead of may, shall at the expense.
Within 6 months of the licensee's
Financial year end. Then the regulator shall, at the expense of the licensee, appoint an auditor.
Yes. The question is that clause 10, as amended, forms part of the bill. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Clause 11.
The question is that clause 11 forms part of the bill. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
The question is that clause 2 forms part of the bill. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Clause 1.
The question is that clause 1 forms part of the bill. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Enacting clause.
The question is that the enacting clause forms part of the bill. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Title.
The question is that the title forms part of the bill. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. House resumes.
Madam President, I am pleased to report that the bill shortly entitled the Nevis International Banking Amendment Bill 2024 has gone through committee stage with one amendment, and I ask that the bill be read a third time and passed.
Thank you. Is there a seconder? Recognize the member for Nevis 1.
Madam President, I rise to support the third reading of the bill, the Nevis International Banking Amendment Bill 2024.
Thank you. The question is that the bill shortly entitled the Nevis International Banking Amendment Bill 2024 be read a third time and passed. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
A bill to amend the Nevis International Banking Ordinance, CAB 7.05 in bracket N, and for matters related thereto or connected therewith.
The bill has been read a third time and passed.
Resolutions.
I recognize the member for Nevis 3.
Madam President, I rise again to present one of two resolutions for today. Resolution of the Nevis Island Administration, the administration acting through its cabinet members, the ministers. Whereas it is provided by Section 44 of the Property Tax Ordinance, Cap 6.13N, that the Minister may make, amend, add to, or replace the regulations establishing the tax rate applicable to each class of taxable property in a financial year. Be it resolved that the Nevis Island Assembly of the Island of Nevis approves the Property Tax Rates Amendment Regulations 2024 made by the Minister of Finance under Section 44 of the Property Tax Ordinance Cap 6.13N.
I recognize the member for Nevis 1.
Madam President, I rise to support the resolution number 2 of 2024 as it regards to the Nevis Island Administration tax amendment.
The question is that your indulgence, member, I'm contemplating whether, given that the resolutions are related, it may not have been appropriate to give the background or context, including the message from the Governor General in relation to it, in relation to this resolution, and then we go into the other. So if you can give a bit more context on it.
My apology, Madam President. We did consult and have approval from the Deputy Governor General for this resolution that was just read a while ago.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable Member. The question is that resolution number 2 of 2024 be adopted. Those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. I have 2.
Madam President, I rise to present the second resolution, number 2 of 2024.
3.
Number 3, of 2024. In exercise of the powers conferred by Section 44 of the Property Tax Ordinance, Cap 6.13N, the Minister responsible for Finance makes the following regulations. Citation. These regulations may be cited as the Property Tax Rates Amendment Regulations 2024 and shall come into effect on the first day of January 2025. Interpretation. In these regulations, ordinance means the Property Tax Ordinance Cap 6.13N. Amendment of Regulation 3A1. Regulation 3A1 is amended by replacing the figure 0.156% with the figure 0.2%.
Recognize the member for Nevis 1.
Madam President, I rise to support the resolution number 3 of 2024. And Madam President, this resolution seeks to, in my mind, make a modest increase in the tax rate on the island of Nevis from 0.156% up to 0.2%. Mr. Mathematician, that's 0. What's Madam President? It's a very small, minimal increase, Madam President. And I hope that the people of Nevis would recognize that while it is a very small increase, that the island of Nevis can very well do with the necessary revenue, Madam President. May it please.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Are there any other contributions?
Adjournment.
Sorry, let me just put the question. The question is that the resolution number 3 of 2024 be adopted. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Next item, please.
Adjournment.
We have anybody willing to move the adjournment of today's sitting?
Madam President, I rise to move the adjournment of this honorable House sitting for today. And Madam President, while I am on my feet, I seek your indulgence for just a moment or two. The island of Nevis, Madam President, would have laid to rest recently the very hard-working and very well-respected Lester Blackett. And Madam President, I happen to be the minister with responsibility for probably all of the departments that Mr. Blackett would have had oversight of at some point. He would have been the director of Public Works. He would have been the director of Physical Planning. He would have been the director of Disaster Management. And I feel, Madam President, that it is important for me at this time to stand in this honorable House to pay tribute to a man who I believe DNA is throughout the length and breadth of this island. I don't believe, Madam President, if we are to truly record the development of the island of Nevis and our modern history, then the name of Mr. Lester Blackett would feature prominently in all sectors of the island of Nevis. When we think about our modern physical planning infrastructure, he was involved. When we think about our advancement in disaster management and the facility at Long Point, Mr. Blackett was involved. When we think about the modern technology and the modern way of doing things in our Public Works Department, Mr. Blackett were involved. And I want to place on record, Madam President, my sincere thanks and appreciation to Mr. Blackett for his contribution to nationhood and to nation building. I believe that his contribution would have, on many occasions, point the island of Nevis in the right direction. And I think that oftentimes, while he was someone who was very excited and very passionate about everything that he did, that we feel that his contribution must be noted and is well noted. And I want to, on behalf of the permanent secretary, the assistant permanent secretary, on behalf of all of the staff who would have worked with Mr. Blackett over the years in the various departments which I have oversight of, to say to his family, and I would even dare to say to his dear wife and daughter, how thankful we are for his contribution. And I believe, Madam President, that the island of Nevis is a much better place because of his involvement. I will not speak too much about his sporting involvement. I believe that at the funeral, the Minister of Youth and Sport would have highlighted that. But I would only say, Madam President, as a youngster in the Stony Grove area, we all used to look behind the galvanized fence and look at men like Mr. Lester Blackett practicing his craft there at the Grove Park, now the El Comido Village Park. So, Madam President, with those few words, I want to say to his family, we are indeed thankful and grateful for his contribution. Madam President, I also want to highlight the passing of one gentleman by the name of Brother Philip from Ramsbury. And again, Madam President, I believe that he was a man ahead of his time. He was a man who sought to engage in certain heavy equipment maintenance and repair. Long before, Madam President, many persons were involved in the heavy equipment. And I believe that his legacy will continue to live on when it comes to heavy equipment. I know that I believe that he attempted to make blocks, Madam President, here on the island of Nevis. And again, he would have made his contribution to the development of Nevis. And Madam President, I did say finally, but I will make this the final. Madam President, it was a dark day for the island of Nevis a few weeks ago, when we learned of the senseless and barbaric. I'm in Parliament, Madam President, so I'll guard my words very carefully. But, Madam President, the murder of young Joel in the Hamilton area, and the attack also on his brother. I have said at a different function, Madam President, that this is not who we are. And this is not who we need to be and who we need to become. I believe, Madam President, that as a society that we have to begin to develop that care and that love and that compassion for our fellow man. And I again want to express my deep sorrow over this incident. I believe that it is something that would have provoked a level of anger in our community. I believe that all right-thinking people must and should and need to continue to condemn this kind of activity in our community. And any crime, Madam President, of any sort, we ought to condemn it unreservedly. So I want to say to the family, we are indeed saddened over their loss. Our mom, Omel, and the entire family, her son, a youngster who will now have to grow up with the pain of losing his mother under these very tragic and unfortunate circumstances. And I would say, Madam President, this is not who we are. I want to say to all of us, regardless of our different opinions, and we as a people do have strong opinion on various issues, we ought not to engage ourselves in these kind of activity. And I want to say to all Nevisians here on the island of Nevis, throughout the Federation, that we must begin and we have to develop a mindset, Madam President, of trying to resolve any difference of opinion or any dispute in a much more civilized way. I believe, Madam President, that our island has been marred and scarred, and I hope that we can just do much better from this kind of incident. Madam President, with those few words, I rise to move the adjournment of this honorable House. May it please you, Madam President.
Thank you, honorable member. I recognize the member for Nevis 4.
Madam President, on the adjournment, I rise just to briefly express my concern about some of the happenings in our community. Too many funerals. I would not list them one by one, but a number of our families are grieving. And unfortunately, it's not just the loss of loved ones that people are struggling with. I am saddened to see that we're going to be struggling additionally with the continued high cost of living here. It seems second only to the loss of loved ones is the continued increases in taxes and the ability to have a good quality of life here on Nevis. And so, Madam President, I think that we all come into this honorable House, not often enough, I would say. I think there are many opportunities for the sustainable development of Nevis that can be advanced by progressive legislation and ordinances. And as we recognize the high level of risk associated with our dependence on external factors, we must begin to look more and more on how we can become more aligned with the current issues of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and food security. And I do look forward, Madam President, to coming to the House of Assembly and having the opportunity to debate on some progressive legislation that I think would be able to help the people of Nevis have better paying jobs, we reduce the struggles that we are seeing, and help to make us more sustainable. Madam President, just recently, we saw in Antigua the United Nations SIDS-4 conference. I think it would have been very beneficial to the people of Nevis if we were provided with some insights as to some of the new innovations, some of the new means of financing that were expressed primarily to assist small island developing states such as St. Kitts and Nevis. And so while it is good that we continue to try to strengthen some of the sectors that have been in existence for a very long time, I say again, Madam President, I look forward to some new legislation being proposed so that together we can help to make Nevis more sustainable. May it please you.
Thank you, honourable member. Member for Nevis 5.
Madam President, I rise on the adjournment to offer condolences to all those families who are mourning at this present time. I wish to offer sincerest condolences to the family of the late Lester Blackett, as well as Brother Philip from Ramsbury. Madam President, I also wish to offer condolences to my own family on the passing of my dear cousin, Joel Darlene Huggins. Madam President, of course, the island of Nevis and perhaps the Federation was indeed shocked on the evening of May 24th to learn of her very tragic passing. And as a family, it really did hit us very, very hard. As a matter of fact, we are still trying to come to terms to understand why the incident took place, why it happened. And of course, there are many questions and perhaps more questions than answers. Madam President, I ask that as a nation, we keep her beloved mother, Omel Huggins, her brothers, Kimoy and Julian Huggins, who also, Julian sustained very serious injuries in that shooting incident. Madam President, often we speak about crime and how important it is for us as a nation to have reduction in crime. And whilst on the adjournment, I am aware that you cannot raise any controversial issues. Madam President, as a nation, we still struggle to grip with the ramifications of criminal activities. I do believe that the ability to capture those responsible for such heinous crimes continues and perhaps would always be one of the major deterrent in crime reduction or criminal activity. So I wish, Madam President, to take this opportunity to thank the Royal St. Christopher and Nevis Police Force, its high-ranking and other members, for their swift reaction to the incident. And as we all are aware, there was an arrest made within a very quick time. I believe it was less than a week. And so I want to thank them for their hard work. I do believe that security is important, and I would like to see more investment in security, national security, in our police, in terms of equipping them with the necessary tools that they need to be able to combat criminal activities. Madam President, as you know, it is quite difficult, perhaps as a parliamentarian and also as a very close family member, to really grapple with the after effects of the death of my dear cousin. Words cannot express the significant impact that this would have on not only her mother, her siblings, but also her young son. And I do ask at this time for compassion, for support from the community, for the Huggins family, and all other related families who are affected or who were affected by this particular crime. Madam President, we continue to pray not only for the family, but also for the community of Hamilton, which seemed to be having a spurge in criminal activity in that particular area. I believe, Madam President, that nothing beats prayer. And so I ask for our nation to be mindful, and let us continue to be our brother's keeper and continue to use every effort, including prayer, to ensure that our nation can perhaps one day be sanctified of such activities. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Member for Nevis 3.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise on the adjournment. I too would like to extend some condolences, but before I do so, I want to start on a lighter note, Madam President. I want at this time to extend heartiest congratulations to the Eastern Caribbean's powerhouse, Vaughan Radio, that is celebrating 36 years today. So today is Vaughan Radio's birthday. And I'm sure that the proceedings of this house are being beamed on the Eastern Caribbean's powerhouse, Vaughan Radio. So Vaughan, the only powerhouse, where only the best will do. Vaughan Radio is celebrating 36 years, and it has been 36 outstanding years of service to the division community, to the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, to the wider region, and to the world. Vaughan Radio has been a beacon here on the island of Nevis, and we thank God for Vaughan Radio. I want to especially commend the manager, Mr. Everett Webber Herbert, who has been at the helm, I think, for the 36 years, and who has done an outstanding job. And I want to extend congratulations to him, the entire staff at Vaughan Radio. Continue the fantastic work, Vaughan Radio. I know that you're going to do an extraordinary job for Culturama 50. So, heartiest congratulations on this, your 36th birthday. I also want to congratulate my very good friend, Mrs. Eileen Liebert of Barnes Gut, who last week celebrated her 90th birthday. And there was a wonderful, wonderful celebration for her at the Malcolm Gishard Park this past Saturday. And I was fortunate to be there. And I really want to commend the children and the grandchildren and all who were part of that, making that fantastic celebration. So, Mrs. Liebert, if you're listening, happy 90th birthday. You should be celebrating for the rest of the month. And I want to say, go to my constituency as well and say, happy belated 70th birthday. That was a milestone as well to Diane Liebert there at Market Shop. And of course, we have heard a lot of condolences being expressed, Madam President, and I want to join because we are going through a very difficult time on Nevis now where deaths are concerned. And last week in particular, we had 6 funerals. 6. I attended 5 of the 6. But I just want to add my voice to extend heartfelt condolences to the family of the late Lester Blackett, Althea Daniel, Maisie Springett, Ivy Kelly, Pastor Evan Douglas, and Shanika Mully. And as we talk about Pastor, also Pastor David Jones, who was laid to rest about 2 weeks ago as well, my good friend. And also to the family of the late Joel Huggins of Hamilton. I want to extend condolences to the member opposite, to you and the entire family of the late Joel Huggins. And of course, to the family of the late Victor Jones of Fountain as well. And finally, this one hits hard home, Madam President. I lost one of my staff members last week, and it has been very, very painful. A young lady, Miss LaSherna Kelly, who has been with the Department of Agriculture for, I think, probably over 15 years. And we lost her, unfortunately, last week. She was a hard worker, family member. I know she was someone who had the will to live and wanted so badly to come back to work. And it was really very painful when we got the news that she had passed. And so I want to extend condolences to the entire staff at the Department of Agriculture, to her husband, Dietrich, and to the children, to the siblings and all of the relatives and all of the friends. May her soul and may the soul of all those departed rest in peace. May it please you, Madam President.
If there no other contributions, well, Member for Nevis 3, can you second the motion?
Madam President, I wish to second the motion for the adjournment of this Honorable House.
Thank you. The question is that this Honorable House be adjourned. Sign and aye. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. House stands adjourned. Sign and aye.